Hi everyone, welcome to the July 2nd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragonin. I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. The two of us are returning from a brief hiatus this week. We missed the past couple weeks of doing these pacecasts and forecasts just due to some scheduling issues and having some other work to do with Belmont Stakes week. And this past week I was away for a little bit, but we're hoping to get back on a more consistent schedule starting this weekend. We've certainly got a nice card of racing to talk about at Belmont Park on Saturday. They're running 5 graded stakes there, including the Met Mile, the Manhattan. We're going to talk about the late pick 4 sequence, which comprises 4 of those graded stakes races, also including the Poker and the Suburban, the last race of the day. We'll get to that in a little bit, though. Craig and I, we're going to begin by talking about some of the racing that we didn't get to recap over the past couple of weeks, including the Belmont Stakes, some of the other major racing from around the country. Craig, how have you been doing since the last time we talked, and where do you want to start with our recap?
I'm doing well here in Oklahoma. It's really hot lately, like face melting hot these last couple days, so I'm staying indoors mostly. But otherwise, things are good here, trying to stay safe with the COVID-19 uprising. I know you guys are on the downturn in New York, so happy to hear that. As far as the racing goes, the Belmont 2 weeks ago, I thought Tiz the Law ran a nice race. He did everything he was supposed to do. I thought he was supposed to win that race. It wasn't a big surprise. He's a very good horse. I have absolutely no knocks on Tiz the Law, but I'm certainly not ready to hand him the Triple Crown. That 120 speed figure he ran isn't eye-popping by any stretch. It's okay. He did what he had to do. But it was only the third best speed figure on the card, and while that might not be all that notable if it was older horses running faster, in this case, it was a pair of 3-year-olds that actually had a pretty big gap on him. Talking about No Parole in the sprint earlier on the card, and then Gamine in the Acorn with her tour de force, who got a 126 and a 125 for their efforts. So I thought those were actually the 2 best performances on the day. We also saw some others around the country, but those were the real 3 big ones of focus that weekend for me.
Yeah, Tiz the Law, it's just a feel-good story. He did what he was supposed to do. He won the race by almost 4 lengths, so I don't want to be too hard on the horse. He beat the field that showed up against him. It wasn't the greatest field that we've ever seen in a Triple Crown race by any stretch. It's just a weird year in that regard, and a lot of connections of top horses. Either those horses went to the sidelines or they didn't rearrange their plans to run this Belmont Stakes. Some of them are just pointing towards the Kentucky Derby, and I get all of that, but Tiz the Law, he's the most accomplished horse at this point in time. You can debate whether or not a horse like Honor AP might surpass him over the summer because he really seems to be on an upward trajectory. But it's going to be interesting to see how these horses continue to develop, and I'm happy to hear that Barclay Tagg's going to run him in the Travers next. He's really not ducking any of the spots with this horse. He's going to dance every dance, and I like to see that. So I'm a fan of Tiz the Law. He might have to get faster to continue to hold this position at the top of the division, but they all will. And as you said, we saw some nice 3-year-old performances on that Saturday card. The real performance that got everybody talking was that one by Gamine in the Acorn. That was just amazing. Right up there with Ruffian as the most impressive Acorn winners I think we've ever seen. Earned a big speed figure for that effort. And I think it remains to be seen how far she ultimately wants to go, if she's really going to be a Kentucky Oaks kind of filly. But if she runs races like that, distance probably isn't going to matter too much.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It kind of reminded me of Rachel Alexandra's Mother Goose, which I think she won by about 20 lengths. It wouldn't have mattered if that race was 1.5 miles on Saturday. Nobody was going to catch her. There's not a whole lot else you can say about it. She's fast. There's a good chance she's the fastest 3-year-old out there of either sex right now, and just a really exciting filly to follow and see where she goes and where she winds up. And as I mentioned, No Parole, I was really blown away with this horse. I didn't particularly like him on this card, but he kind of showed last race in that race at Oakland Park when he stepped back into open company after that, and into a sprint after that not very good effort in the Rebel, but I don't think that was all that surprising. But that day at Oaklawn, he outran a lot of really good speed horses to make an easy lead, and I probably should have took more note of that because he did the same exact thing on Saturday. He just put away what on paper looked like some really good speed horses. Now, granted, Echo Town had a little bit of trouble at the break, but I don't think it was enough to make a big difference at all in here, and No Parole just kept going. He's the kind of horse I really like. He's fast. There's no doubt what his strategy is when the gate opens. He's going to go as fast as he can, as long as he can. And for right now, I think he is clearly the top 3-year-old sprinter, even above his stablemate, whose name I'm forgetting. I think it has a long in it, but this was some effort for me.
Yeah, No Parole. It's funny. He's the kind of horse that I'm just going to be wrong about more often than not because he won his first few starts so impressively, didn't look like he was really pushed to win those races and didn't earn speed figures that really suggested he was among the top sprinters out there. But he's one of these rare horses. And I say that he's a rare horse because typically it doesn't pan out this way, but he's one of these horses that actually could run faster when he was really asked to do so. And Tom Amoss, he's brought him along slowly, I think slowly progressing up from these Louisiana bred races into Stakes Company, trying that softer allowance race at Oaklawn last time, and then finally moving up into the Woody Stevens. It just really worked for this horse, and this was the best effort we saw out of him. The kind of speed figure that he earned, it's as good as the kind that we've seen from some of the older horses, so he could be a real player in the sprint division. That other Tom Amoss horse that you referenced, Long Weekend, I thought he was the best horse in the barn. After this performance from No Parole, maybe we have to reevaluate that position, but it's an enviable position for Tom Amoss to be in with these two horses. He just has to keep them apart, I guess, because they both have similar running styles. But No Parole, I admit that I had a bad opinion about him. He's just a really talented, fast horse.
Yeah, you're not alone. Like I said, I didn't like him either because, as I said, he's not the... Normally, these horses don't improve or can run faster, as a lot of people say, but he's one that clearly did. There were a couple other good performances that week. I don't want to spend too much time on them. I like the effort by Factor This. He kind of backed up his races at the fairgrounds. Alexandra made that breathtaking close in the sprint race to beat the boys. Got a nice 119 figure. So that was about it for me from 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you have any more comments on those races.
No, I mean, Belmont Stakes, as you said, there's a lot we could talk about, but those were the performances that really stood out for me. And we should probably talk a little bit about last weekend as well, because we saw some big performances on that Churchill Downs card.
Yeah, for sure. That's and Belmont as well, too. We'll get to some of those. But I think the clear highlight was Tom's d'Etat. He won with a 129 TimeformUS speed figure. He won right off that win at Oaklawn where, I don't think he was visually all that impressive. His figure was pretty good. He had a little bit of a wide trip that day, but this one was impressive. Watching the race, he broke really well, established an early position we didn't see in that race at Oaklawn, and just went on from there. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think it was a tough trip by any matters. It's probably about as easy a trip as he's going to get. But he ran very fast doing so. The final time figure was a 132 for the race. A lot of people tried to compare that to Midnight Bisou, and we're looking at the huge time difference. Because of pace factor, she got a 121 compared to his 129. And I'm actually comfortable with that in this situation. I think that probably is a pretty good indicator of the gap of inability between the two. I don't think final time, where it was like over a second and a half, I think was really a true indicator. But those two were the highlights for the weekend. No knocking Midnight Bisou at all. She did what she had to do, coming back from that big effort she had in Saudi Arabia. Sat off the fast pace of Serengeti Empress, who I actually liked in this race. I thought she'd be loose, but she just doesn't seem to rate anymore, or maybe that's a strategy, as we discussed a little on Twitter. It's not going to work at these high grade level, grade 1 level races against top older horses like Midnight Bisou. So maybe they'll go back to the drawing board, give her another shot. But I thought both of those races were very good efforts.
Yeah, I totally agree about Tom's d'Etat. I mean, we rarely get to see horses continuing to run into their 7-year-old year, and you just see with Tom's d'Etat, he's always been a good horse. He was posting gigantic speed figures, I think, going all the way back to when he was a 4-year-old, but having that additional time to mature and really get over any physical issues, he's just operating at a higher level at this point in time, and he's towards the top of the handicap division. I know this was just a grade 2 race with Stephen Foster, but this was a grade 1 performance, and the speed figure, as you said, it attests to that. I agree with what you said about the final time of this race. I think the speed figures, the way that you do them, incorporating pace, it really makes it easier to explain why the figs worked out the way that they did. I think if you're just making final time figs, you've got to monkey with them a little bit more to get them to make sense, because there would be a big disparity between Tom's d'Etat and Midnight Bisou. But Tom's d'Etat was just better than these horses. The trip that he got, as you said, it's the kind that you want to see the best horse get, because Miguel Mena kept him in the clear throughout, had him closer to the pace than he was last time, but it didn't matter. He just closed off his own fractions and really came home in fast time, as good horses can do when they work out trips like that. So I'm very impressed by Tom's d'Etat. And Midnight Bisou, the final time was slower, but as you alluded to, the pace had everything to do with that. I mean, we had a slight, I guess, difference of opinion about Serengeti Empress. I wouldn't argue with you that she is a horse who's run well, setting fast paces many times in the past. I just thought this was a little too extreme. I mean, Joe Talamo came out like it was a sprint race riding her and opened up 3 or 4 lengths and was even pushing her down the backstretch to go faster. That just didn't quite make sense to me. I didn't think they had to go that fast on the front end, and the pace figures really they tell the whole story. I mean, she was getting some TimeformUS pace ratings in the early going that were well above 150, which you just can't really do in a 2-turn dirt race.
Totally agree.
And she paid the price for that. But Midnight Bisou, I mean, I saw a lot of people saying that she got a perfect trip in here. I think that she got a good trip within the context of the race relative to her main rival, Serengeti Empress. But if you just look at Midnight Bisou's pace figure line in isolation, it looks like that of a horse that set a fast pace. She was just tracking a horse that was going even faster on the front end. So I think that's why Midnight Bisou came home a little bit slower than some people would have expected. But she is a really nice horse. And I think at this point in time, she cemented herself at the top of this division.
Yeah, and I came around once I did the figures more to your thinking. There's going fast and setting fast paces and running well, but I think they're overdoing it at this point. You got to rate a little bit going 1.125 miles, and those tactics, just like I said earlier, they're not going to work. I didn't have the actual numbers, and when I was talking to you, I didn't realize just how big the discrepancy was on pace. You made a great point about Midnight Bisou. If you just look at her pace figures in isolation, she would be in red just by herself. That's how fast the pace was. So good effort from her. A couple others I do want to talk about before we move on to the pick 4 this week is a couple of races at Belmont. First off, newspaper record. I thought she was just phenomenal again. She ran a 128 TimeformUS speed figure, which I think matched the fig she got in her return. And she's back. Very rarely in my days of following racing have I seen a horse kind of, I hate to use the word flop, but I would say her 3-year-old season was just a complete washout. Nothing really good happened. She didn't win a race. She was very disappointing. And particularly for a filly to come back from that, I just haven't seen it very often where they rebound as a 4-year-old like a completely new horse. So hats off to Chad Brown. He obviously did a great job. The guy's a phenomenal trainer. There's no doubt about that. And whatever he did, he found what was going on last year and fixed it, because she looks like a champ this year. And the other horse we talked about a couple times early in the year is Mean Mary. And man, has she really become something. Now, we can argue and people can talk and say she keeps getting easy leads and nobody challenges her, but this filly can run. She just goes, and until that day comes where somebody's willing to go with her and throw down some fractions, because it's not like she's crawling up front in these 1.5 mile races for the distance. She's setting pretty legitimate fractions, and she just keeps on going. So I'm not sure what the ceiling is for her or how she'll react when she gets confronted early, but she's been super impressive this year.
Yeah, I would echo those sentiments about Mean Mary and Newspaper of Record as well. Newspaper of Record, she did end up getting some of the rain that she likes to receive before her races. I know the turf course is rated firm, but I see you've got it as a 6 in the system, so that's not really a firm turf course. They just didn't change the rating, but it was probably more of a good to yielding type of course that she ran over. But that said, she's now done it twice in a row this year. Chad Brown just really seems to have gotten her to shut off just enough early in her race. She's still keen racing down the backstretch when she comes out of the gate, but they're able to get her to finish and re-brake, which is something she really couldn't do in the past. So I liked the effort out of her. She's earning the kinds of speed figures that you see from horses that are typically crowned champions in this division. So we'll see if she can do it around 2 turns in the future. I think that's the only remaining question for her, and if she can do it over a really hard turf course, faster ground. But I kind of get the sense that they've gotten her figured out at this point, and if she stays in this kind of form, she's going to be tough to beat in any race where she shows up. And Mean Mary too. I mean, yeah, the pace worked out in her favor and she's gotten a lot of perfect trips, but it does seem like she's the kind of horse as a 4-year-old who's just improving with every start. And she just is able to make her own good trips because there typically isn't a lot of pace in these turf marathon races. And she's just always going to be tough to pass in the stretch when she's able to produce closing fractions like we saw from her in that New York. So I've become a fan of hers. She just seems like a really nice filly who's improving.
Well, I think that probably wraps up our recap. I'm sure there's more races we could talk about if we wanted to dig deep, but I think most people tune in to hear what we're going to bet on the weekend. So why don't we get started there?
All right, let's dive into that pick 4 sequence at Belmont on Saturday, and we're going to begin with the 8th race. It's the Grade 3 Poker going a mile on the Widener turf course, and a lot of these stakes races came up as pretty competitive affairs, probably none more so than this one. You can make a case for a lot of horses in this race. I don't really know who the horse to beat is. I would guess the favorite's going to be on the outside, the number 9 Value Proposition. In some ways, he has more to prove than a lot of his rivals, as he's never really been competitive against stakes company before, but he's got Irad Ortiz riding, who just seems to be able to do no wrong at Belmont Park right now, and he was pretty impressive in his return from the layoff against optional claimers last time. So he seems like one that's going to be tough in this race if he continues to move forward, but there are many to consider.
There are. It's a deep race. I don't envy you at all having to make the morning line in this race. I have no idea where I'd even started. So good job on that. We'll see how it plays out, but you're not going to get any complaints from me because it's a super tough race no matter how it gets bet. As far as the horses in the field, I'm actually not giving up on Got Stormy yet. She seems to be pretty maligned on social media, and when I watch on the Fox show, people are kind of writing her off. But I mean, in reality, this is just a Grade 3 race. The field is strong for a Grade 3, but she's a Grade 1 mare, in my opinion. Now, she may have tailed off just a little bit, but I personally think that's being over-exaggerated to a point. I mean, she's a horse who lost by a neck in the Grade 1 Frank Kilroe out at Santa Anita. Now, we can argue if that race is really a Grade 1. Maybe it's more like a Grade 2, but it was also against males. I thought she ran well that day, and I'm not going to knock her too much for that effort last time where she just came up empty, chasing Rushing Fall after not the greatest break in the world. I think she was in that bad chase position that, as a handicapper, I hate for my horses to be in because you're kind of out there in no man's land where you do the dirty work. And in this case, Rushing Fall was a very good horse, ran very fast. So I actually think Got Stormy has a big shot in here, and I'm going to make her an A in my top pick. There's some others I'll use, but I'd like to hear what you think of her first.
Yeah, she's one of the more difficult calls for me in this race because I kind of hear what you're saying, and I see where you're going with that because I don't know how much money she's going to take in this race. I kind of don't think she's going to be favored, and based on most of her form from the past year, she's just faster than these horses and classier than these horses. Her last race, though, it's hard for me to get past because I know she lost to Rushing Fall, who's a really good horse, and maybe Rushing Fall just broke her heart when she ran away from Got Stormy at the top of the stretch. I didn't like the way Got Stormy just completely tied up at the end of that race, and I mean, really almost went back to last at the end. I mean, she was fading very badly at the last furlong of that race. She's not supposed to get passed by a horse like Passing Out for third at the end. And I've seen that from her in her other races this year. even in the kill row, she had that race won at the 8th pole, and she just kind of tied up at the end and let horses pass her. And I don't know. It's not a fitness issue because she's raced a bunch of times already this year, and Mark Cassie's been working her pretty hard in the morning, throwing down all those bullets. It just seems like something's a little off with her. So maybe they've gotten her to rebound, and the fact that he's running her against males, maybe that's all a good sign. I just don't quite trust her. I'll use her defensively, but I prefer others. And if I had to kind of, direct the conversation somewhere else to talk about some other horses in here, I would look for some value because I'm not a big fan of Valid Point, who's the other Chad Brown horse that could take money. For me, he's just got to get a lot faster. I know he had some trouble in that Shadwell Turf Mile last year. I'm just not a big fan of that horse. Talking about some of the bigger prices, I'm pretty interested in Seismic Wave. He is a horse that also has to get faster, but he's one of these that's coming off his 3-year-old season. He's now making his second start as a 4-year-old. He certainly has a right to improve his speed figures, and the 7 furlongs they asked him to go last time, that's probably just a little bit on the short side for him. I really think the mile is his best distance. They tried to go longer a bunch of times last year, and just the nature of those longer races, a mile and an eighth, a mile and a quarter, you're going to catch slower paces. That doesn't do him any favors. You're also just, you're going to need more stamina, and I don't think he really has that. He's got more of a turn of foot that's effective going a mile. We saw that in the English Channel 2 back, and I think he's the kind of horse that could take a step forward second off the layoff, and he'll probably be a decent price. So I'm leaning towards him as my top pick, but as I said, there are a lot of horses that you can make a case for.
Yeah, there are. And outside of Got Stormy, for me, I'm not as down on Valid Point as you, but it's for the same reason I think this is a deep contentious race. It's because he's a 4-year-old, and I'm not going to judge him too harshly on his lower speed figures. You could say the same thing for Seismic Wave. You could say the same thing for Social Paranoia, even Eons. So outside of Got Stormy, I'm probably going to go pretty deep with Bees in this race. It's not a race I'm looking to narrow my ticket down on. Eons is one I will definitely have on my tickets just because the trainer does really well off of layoffs like this. He showed me enough talent last year, and he's been off a while, so I just know people are going to bet him off those slower speed figures that we saw last year, and he'll be a big price. The only horses I really wouldn't use in here are probably Dream Friend and Hawkish, the 1 and the 3. I'd have a hard time seeing any of those winning. And the one who I would say is just a complete defensive move if I use would be Social Paranoia. I'm just not a big fan of this horse. I know he won the Appleton earlier this year, but I'm kind of judging him off that race. He got a just absolutely perfect trip that day, huge pace, came from well off of it, and he still only ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. He's disappointed a couple times since, so he's one that if I do wind up leaving somebody out for cost-saving measures, it would be him of the shorter prices.
Well, before I transition, I'll just make the case for the 2 horses that you left out because they're horses that I want to use in this race. Dream Friend, I know he's not really a winning type and he doesn't have stakes form like the rest of these, but keep in mind, he's coming out of a race where Hidden Scroll ran off on the front end, so he was actually chasing Hidden Scroll and maybe got suckered into running faster than he would have had to in the early going. So I wouldn't put too much stock in the fact that he faded and got passed late in that race. Dream Friends run a bunch of speed figures that put him right in the mix here, and I think he's dangerous because he could be loose on the front end here. And also, Hawkish, I agree that his form is a little bit spotty and probably not what it once was, but he had some trouble last time and didn't run that much worse than my pick Seismic Wave, so I don't want to dismiss him at a bigger price. I think this is a pretty competitive race where I can make a case for almost everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I can see those. I'm just not a big all guy. My one negative with Dream Friend is I just have a hard time seeing him win him with Got Stormy being the one who's probably going to sit right outside of him. But if she doesn't show up and regresses like a lot of people think maybe she is, maybe he gets clear. So I can see that.
All right, I don't think we helped people at all there because we talked about every horse in the race. So let's move on to the Met Mile and try to narrow things down a little bit more. This race, I mean, it really kind of boils down to the top 3 contenders, the 3 favorites, Vekoma, McKinsey, and Code of Honor. We'll see how they bet the race and who ends up going off the favorite. Seems like they'll be very closely grouped. I mean, there are things to like about all of these horses. McKinsey, obviously, if he puts forth the kind of effort that we saw from him in the Met Mile last year, he's going to be really tough to beat. The question with McKinsey is what kind of form is he coming into this race in, because he didn't earn a particularly formidable speed figure in his return in the Triple Bend, that was just a prep, but he's going to have to move forward. Vekoma, you've got to question whether he can reproduce that huge Carter fig over a dry track. And Code of Honor, he just kind of has to take a step forward, second off the layoff.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty open race too. Now, as a vertical player, I got to be honest, I'm probably going to go a different direction because I actually really like Mr. Freeze in here. I'm not saying he's the most likely winner, but I think he's the one most likely to get lost in the wagering. I really just absolutely despised his trip last time out in that Oaklawn handicap where he somehow wound up well off the piece. He goes back to Manny Franco, who's a much more aggressive rider, draws a good outside post, and if this horse is double digits, he's a horse I'll probably key on in my verticals and make him an AA horse. Warrior's Charge, who's outside of him, is probably his main threat, but while he's a good horse, he's one I was a big fan of, but I've been a little disappointed in him. He's never really made that huge step to run in grade 1 type figures, which I thought he would have by now. So I'm going to dismiss him a little bit and go with Mr. Freeze. Of the others, not a big fan of Vekoma drawing that inside post. We haven't seen a lot of him getting shuffled back or having to maneuver his way through traffic. Now, maybe he sits just behind those two as our pace projector shows and gets a good trip and is able to tip out. But with McKenzie and Code of Honor in here, I think it's probably going to be a little bit tougher than that. So of the big three, I'd probably be the least likely to bet Vekoma in here. I have similar concerns with you as McKenzie. I will say his last race, a speed figure of 118, it probably was held back by pace as well. It wasn't a very good field. The pace was slow, but it's not like he came from 10 lengths behind. He was only like a length and a half behind early. Visually, it wasn't that exciting of a race for me to watch. I didn't get the impression it was the 2019 version of McKenzie that we were seeing his last time out. If Bob Baffert has him ready and he's back to his 4-year-old form in this one, he's certainly a main contender, but he's not one I'll be keying on. So of the big three, I would say Code of Honor is probably the one I would lean most heavily on out of those. He's actually the longest price of those three on your morning line, and I think he has the most upside. He ran some big figures as a 3-year-old. I was impressed with his return, where I don't think he was fully cranked up to win that race, and I expect better, and yet he still ran a 122 speed figure despite being really, really wide. So looking for a big effort from him too.
Yeah, I'll touch briefly on all the horses you just mentioned because I think they all are horses that there's something to say about. I mean, McKenzie, it sounds like we're on the same page. He kind of has to prove it to me in this race. I really respect everything that he's done in his career, and his best effort's going to beat this field. If he's going to be one of the shorter prices, I think this might be the right time to take a shot against him. I've watched some of his recent workouts, and I'm not an expert of horse flesh like some are, but in my opinion, he's looked sharper in the past, and I just want to take a shot against him in this race. Vekoma, I'd be a little bit more optimistic than you are. The one thing that kind of doesn't make me worried about that inside draw is that he's been so sharp out of the gate this year. When they open those stalls, I mean, he just busts out of there and takes an advantage right away in his races. They don't always go on with him. Sometimes they rein him in. But in this race, maybe they should go on and create some separation. If Warrior's Charge wants to go, then let him. They can slot outside of that horse, but I think Vekoma is going to be tough in here because I've always thought 1 turn, 7 furlongs to a mile, that's the perfect distance for him. I don't think he's some kind of sloppy track freak where that's why he ran so well last time. He can do it over fast tracks as well, and I'm not going to be shocked if they get to the top of the stretch and Vekoma spurted away by 2 lengths and he's the horse to catch in here. I think he's going to be very dangerous and hard to beat. So I'm using him prominently. We're on the same page about Code of Honor. Of the shorter prices, he probably is going to work out the best trip because I do think they'll move a little bit up front with both Vekoma and Warrior's Charge in here, given the way the posts worked out. So I do think Code of Honor is going to get enough pace to close into, and I'm fairly certain he can run faster than what we saw out of him last time because he did it as a 3-year-old, and by all appearances, he's improved now as a 4-year-old, so I think we're going to see a forward move out of him. So I like Code of Honor quite a bit. He and Vekoma would probably be my top 2 picks in here in some order. As for the others, Mr. Freeze, I don't quite know what to do with him because on one hand, he's got that gigantic speed figure in the Gulfstream Park Mile that puts him right in the mix here. And based purely on that, he's a major contender. I don't know if I totally believe in that race. It wasn't the strongest field. That number's a bit of an outlier for Fat Man. Hog Creek Hustle's form has kind of fallen apart since then. And while I agree with you about his trip in the Oaklawn handicap, it wasn't right for him, and a mile and eighth is probably a little too far. I don't quite buy that Mr. Freeze is quite this good. Maybe I'm being a little stubborn about that because the figures say otherwise. But he's not quite for me in this race. I'll use him as maybe a B or a C in pick 4 sequence, but I wanted to lean elsewhere. I wouldn't totally rule out Endorsed. I know that Code of Honor beat him last time, and you would expect Code of Honor to move forward second off the layoff, but Endorsed made this big premature move down the backstretch last time in that Westchester. A mile is supposed to be fine for him as well. He's got the tactical speed to maybe get the jump on Code of Honor once again. He's not the most likely winner by any stretch, but he's going to be a horse that could get somewhat lost in the wagering here, so I wouldn't discount him either.
Yeah, Endorsed is the one other horse I was actually going to mention, and it's precisely because of what you said. He actually made up 6 lengths to take the lead, and it almost felt like a blink of an eye, and I do think that was a little early, and he still dug in, so I have nothing wrong with that effort. He got a 125 figure that day. With him, unlike Vekoma, I agree with you. I don't think he's any sloppy track guy. Maybe it was a little bit due to the mud. He's run pretty good in the mud before, but at a good price, I'm willing to give him a chance. I am glad you brought up the Mr. Freeze figure. I do want to mention that a little bit. I'm going to go back. I had already decided this today before you mentioned it, because something I've been doing the past month or so is all the mile races at Gulfstream, I go and time them from video and adjust the times, because with Trackus and that short run up, the times just aren't reliable, and it was something I wasn't doing back then. So I do want to do that as a double check, and if I do make any changes, I'll certainly put it out on Twitter, and it would certainly affect my betting as well. But it's something I've taken to do, and it's had some pretty good results. I'm not saying that figure is not legit. It may turn out that the race is timed just fine and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's something I've learned. I mean, I've always known there were some issues there, but they're a little bit bigger than I realized at first. So the video timing's really helped out, and I will let people know if that makes a change.
Let's move on to the other grade 1 on this card, the Manhattan, the 10th race, mile and a quarter on the inner turf course. And kind of like the other turf race in the sequence, the Poker, this one is also very competitive. I would imagine the favorite is going to be down towards the rail, the number 1 in Stilled Regard. This horse has not won a grade 1 race yet, but he's been pretty competitive in, well, a couple of them. First and foremost coming to mind are the Pegasus World Cup Turf, where he was 3rd, and the Kentucky Derby going back to 2018 when he was 4th in that race back in Jerry Hollendorfer's barn. In Stilled Regard has always been a really nice horse, and I think it's just been a matter of getting him to win races and getting him into top form and finding what he really wants to do best. I think Chad Brown has found that with routing on the turf. The big question is a mile and a quarter going to be the best distance for him? And do you really want to take a short price on a horse like this that's stepping up in class? Because all of these horses ridden by Irad Ortiz take a lot of money, and there are a lot of horses to consider that are going to be better prices.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't love Instilled Regard in here. It's still fresh in my mind what happened to him when he went up against Factor This, when I think he went off the favorite that day and did no running when Factor This kind of got away. Granted, he rebounded with a nice win. He got a 124 TimeformUS speed figure when he won that Fort Marcy last time out. He did get a really nice pace to run into, made it a good close. But for that reason, I'm actually going to lean towards a bit of a price in here as my top pick, and that's going to be Mike Maker's Cross Border. He's a horse who I just see lone on the front end. He's going back to a distance, which I think is going to be really comfortable for him. When you look at our pace projector, the closest horse shown to him is Instilled Regard. And I've seen that act before a couple times. And what happens is Instilled Regard is usually not the horse who winds up tracking the speed. And that just tells me this horse is going to get a really, really easy lead in here. He ran some really nice figures last year that could win this race. And he's the one I'm going to lean pretty heavy on, especially in vertical bets, but in horizontal as well. As it's a little tough to predict lone on the lead races on the turf at a mile and a quarter, but if there's one I'm pretty confident in that's going to be all alone, it's this one.
Yeah, he's a horse that I've given a long look to in this race, and I haven't finalized my picks yet, and I don't know if I'm going to make him my top pick, that being Cross Border. But I agree with you. He's very dangerous in this race for the reasons you mentioned, the pace, and also just kind of dissecting his form a little bit. This horse has really improved. I mean, there's an argument that he could have won the Turf Classic last year if they had not gotten so caught up in strangling him off the pace in the early going, because he looked like the speed that day too, and this was before they realized he could be effective as a front runner. And Manny Franco, I assume riding to instructions, just wrangled him back off the pace. He got so ranked, he got into traffic after that, and even after all that trouble, he only lost by 2.5 lengths to some really nice horses. So, I mean, we might be having a different conversation about Cross Border if he had gotten the right ride that day, because he could already be a Grade 1 winner. But since then, I think he's run well in some graded stakes races. The McKnight, he got beat by Spooky Channel, but I thought Cross Border did all the dirty work up front that day. And last time out, I mean, getting beat by Value Proposition, I mean, that's no disgrace, and a mile is probably a little short for him these days. I think Cross Border is very dangerous. We'll see how he's ridden and how the others, whether they press him or not, but he's one I definitely want to use. I have no knock against Instilled Regard. I think he's going to get the 10 furlongs without any issues. I mean, he got it in the Kentucky Derby on the dirt, so I don't really have any questions about his stamina. It's just a question of price and how likely he really is to win this race. He might be the most likely winner, but I don't know if I want to take 2-1 or shorter on him. I've had a lot of people whose opinions I respect telling me that I've got this line totally wrong, and maybe I do, and that Rock Emperor could be the favorite in this race or is going to be the second choice. Maybe he will be the second choice, because I really struggled with this line, and I'm not sure what to do with a horse like Sadler's Joy, who we'll get to in a little bit. I didn't know how to peg him on the line or how other people are going to assess him. But Rock Emperor, what do you make of this horse? Because I know some people think he's the best of the Chad Brown runners in this race. I mean, I'll just give my take. I know he beat Instilled Regard in that Muniz. I don't know how much stock I want to put in that race, because that Fairgrounds turf course was very hard and sort of... the form of those races is a little bit wacky. I don't think Instilled Regard's really that much worse than, or really as bad as his finish there, because both of his surrounding performances are so much better. And I was a little disappointed by Rock Emperor in the Whittingham last time. I mean, obviously, he never should have been disqualified, in my opinion, for what was an infraction that I thought hindered him more than it helped him. But still, I mean, United's a nice horse, but I thought Rock Emperor had dead aim and couldn't get it done, and he barely beat Originaire, who'd be a big price in this race. I know that was, I mean, he was technically losing to a horse that almost won the Breeders' Cup Turf, but I just thought Rock Emperor would have to improve a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm not a big fan of the Southern California Turf Division. I generally think they're a grade below what we see back east. So a grade 2 out west is more like a grade 3 here. And this is a grade 1, and he couldn't get it done. Yeah, there was some traffic problems, but he still got beat fair and square by United. So I'm not a big fan of him. I didn't blink twice when I saw the line. Maybe that's my personal bias on those California races. And I don't put a lot of stock in that race at the fairgrounds where he beat Instilled Regard, because frankly, Instilled Regard just didn't run that day. I mean, if you're basing him off that race, then there's no way you even consider him at 2-1 in this race, because I mean, he wouldn't have a chance. He rebounded, showed he wasn't himself that day. So not a big Rock Emperor fan at all. Sadler's Joy, I divorced him a while ago, particularly at this 1.25 mile distance. I don't give him much of a chance. Maybe if there was a complete just plethora of speed in here, and I thought that the race was going to totally melt down, I'd give him more of a chance. But he's a horse I just can't be too big on. Devamani's a horse I bet last time and got a pretty, I won't say a tough beat, because he got beat fair and square, but I think everything went right his day, so I don't particularly love him as much. I do think Spooky Channel is probably being overlooked a little bit at 15-1 on the morning line. I'm not saying your line's wrong, but I think he is a better horse than that. He showed that he can be versatile. I think the distance will be just fine for him. I think he couldn't handle 1.5 miles, but 1.25 miles is a little bit different story. So he's one I'd use on my tickets as well as probably a C type. But if he wins, I want to have his price on my ticket.
Yeah, as you know, I have, let's call it SJDS, Sadler's Joy Derangement Syndrome, because I always try to make a case for this horse. And I mean, in this situation, it's a little bit difficult because while he is in some ways the classiest horse in this race in the sense that he's achieved the best results against Grade 1 company in the past, his recent form, it leaves a little to be desired. It's hard to argue against the assertion that he's lost a step this year, especially in that Tiller last time. I know that was probably just a prep for this, and the pace did hold together in that race, but he didn't show that usual turn of foot we see out of him. He was just kind of dull. And while he has run well in this race in the past, particularly back in 2018 when he was arguably the best horse in the Manhattan, I just don't know if he still has the speed and turn of foot to win going this short now as a 7-year-old. So I'm not picking him in this race. It pains me to say. Maybe I'll use him defensively as a B or a C in pick fives, but I've got to go elsewhere this time. I mean, if I'm looking at horses coming out of the Tiller, Dot Matrix is a viable option. He ran the better race that day, kind of making a premature move on the backstretch, going wide the entire way. A mile and 3/8, I mean, he can get it, but a mile and a quarter might be the best distance for him, even though he's never tried it before because he's been successful going shorter and longer than this. So he's a viable option to me. Devamani's not quite for me, and I think Channelmaker's off form. I'm not really with you on Spooky Channel, but I could make a case for 5 horses in this race, and you're probably getting the sense that I haven't quite finalized my picks yet, but I would use some combination of all of those.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. The one thing I've noticed is that there just isn't a lot of speed on any of these races we've talked about so far. I don't have a whole lot more to add to that. If you're ready to move to the Suburban, I am. But that's another race we're going to talk about where there's just not a whole lot of pace. So it seems to be a theme in this pick 4.
Yeah, let's finish up with this Suburban. It's a nice field for the Suburban. It's only a Grade 2 event, but we've got some horses coming out of Grade 1 races, some horses that were very competitive as 3-year-olds. We've got the Belmont Stakes winner, Sir Winston, in this field. Tacitus, who placed in, I think, 4 Grade 1 races last year. Tacitus, I guess he'll be the slight favorite in this race. So there are 2 ways to look at this horse, and we've had this conversation many times, it seems. Either he's just a horse that doesn't want to win and he's always going to disappoint, or he's a horse that has just had a bunch of legitimate excuses. I think it's harder to really stick with that second line of thinking coming into this race given his 2020 form, because his Saudi Cup was okay, and that was a really tough field, so I don't want to be too hard on him for it. But his Oaklawn handicap, that was not the strongest race in the world. By my standards, Warriors Charge, Mr. Freeze, that was too far for him. I mean, they're okay, but Tacitus was just kind of dull that day. Maybe getting back out to the mile and a quarter is going to help. Maybe getting a bit more pace will help him. Just, if he's the favorite in this race, I want to look elsewhere.
Yeah, I hate to say it. I haven't quite divorced Tacitus yet like I have Hidden Scroll, who I've gotten rid of, Sagler's Joy. Sometimes I learn when to get off the wagon. Sometimes I don't. But Tacitus, I agree with you. If he's probably, 8 to 5, 9 to 5 in here. He's not a horse I want to lean on because he's really hard to trust. I mean, I can't even remember. Was his last win the Wood Memorial, I think?
It was.
I'm pretty sure that was it. And he's run many times since then, been a short price. So while I might use him defensively in here, he's not one. I'm just not going to key on him anymore until he proves me differently. The value is betting against him. And I think long term, you always need to play the value. The horse I'm most interested to watch, of course, is Mr. Buff. He ran that gigantic speed figure on our numbers 2 back. Now, granted, I think he was helped by the track that day. It was obviously much weaker competition. And then he didn't run back to it, which wasn't really a surprise to me. That I didn't expect him to run back to a 136 or whatever it was that day that he got. But I thought he ran okay. He's going to be loose again here. I think the mile and a quarter is a question. But for me as a fan, he's the horse I want to see and hope he's going to do well. But again, he doesn't offer a lot of value for me. I think he might wind up getting pressured by Moretti, who's drawn outside and comes off of that big win in the flat out stakes at a mile and 3/8. that one seems kind of an aberration in his past performances. It was over a sloppy track. He hadn't shown speed for a few races, but I doubt they're going to change the plan here. So it's hard for me to be comfortable thinking that Mr. Buff would be free and clear in this field and going that extra distance and being a fairly short price. I'm going to go against him too. So the horse I wound up that I'm really going to lean pretty heavy in here is Sir Winston. He came back in that same flat out stakes. He didn't run particularly well. He was a distant second to Moretti. But again, it was over a sloppy track. There's no way in my mind he was fully cranked for that race. He's obviously got a lot of talent, being a Belmont Stakes winner. And I just think he's probably sitting on a good race. I'm putting a line through the last one, which I think you really have to do if you're going to make him the winner in here. But I really think he's sitting on that race, and he's going to be the big focus for me. I doubt we'll see this kind of value on him if he wins again, but I do think we're going to get it on Saturday.
So, I really like Mr. Buff in this race, so I'll just get that out of the way straight off. I just think this is the time for him to get that graded stakes victory. And I've talked about this in the past. I've always wanted to see them try longer distances with him because he's this gigantic strapping horse who can just sort of gallop his foes into the ground. Kind of reminds me of Diversify in that sense, who also won this race as a New York bred. And I just feel like he's going to be so loose on the front end. I mean, you mentioned Moretti as a horse that could possibly press him. I don't see how Moretti's in the same zip code early. I mean, I know that he set the pace last time going 1 3/8, but I mean, when Moretti's been close to the front, it's been in pretty slow pace situations. I know we've got that coded as a fast pace in the flat out in our PPs. We've talked a lot about those marathon races at Belmont on the dirt. I wouldn't put too much stock in that. I just don't think Moretti's nearly fast enough to stay with Mr. Buff early. And Mr. Buff is always most dangerous when he gets loose on the front end. He doesn't have to go slow. He can set a legitimate pace. He just keeps going. And I think he's going to be really tough to catch in this race. I know he's got that curse of not being able to do it against graded stakes company, but I just think this is the right time for him. And he's in the best form of his career right now as a 6-year-old. I really hope he wins this race as a fan, and I think he's going to do it. I'm also a big fan of Sir Winston, as you know. His last race, I'm willing to give him the excuse of the sloppy track and the fact that nobody pressed Moretti because that was a race where Moretti just kind of got to, I mean, he didn't go slowly, but he set an unchallenged pace, and that really helped him in the slop that day. And Sir Winston, I mean, he ran so well in that optional claim or two back. That was second off a layoff. I think second off a layoff here, he can really take a step forward. He needs some pace to close into, as he always does, but I do think he's capable of taking that step forward as a 4-year-old. I go back to his Belmont and his Peter Pan when he ran the kinds of speed figures that put him in the mix here. So if he's the third choice in this race, and a distant one at that, he's a horse that I could definitely upgrade. So I would go 4-6-1 in this race as my top 3 picks, and I think some combination of those horses will win. I just prefer Mr. Buff pretty strongly.
Yeah, and we have the same 3. That's exactly the same 3 I use on my tickets. And Mr. Buff's actually a case if I bet somebody else and he wins by 10, I'll still be happy because I'm a fan of the game and I really like the horse. And again, I don't have any big knocks on him. I do think it's interesting you picked him off that last race. A lot of people just criticized him and said, oh, hey, that last race was a fluke. But I actually think that race is a lot better than it looks and that he's going to run well. I'm just a little worried about the value. And of course, playing pick 4s, we're not going to get to see that. But it wouldn't surprise me if he wound up being the horse 7-2 in a field like this. I think the big takeaway for me is just I can't play Tacitus vertically. Would it shock me if he won by 5 and ran a 130 TimeformUS speed figure? It wouldn't, because I mean he's a horse who's consistently ran mid 120s for a while, but he does that without ever really getting too close to winning. So he's the kind of I've learned to get away from. They just seem to beat you up over time, and they're bankroll killers. And if they beat you, it's one you just got to tip your hat and say, good job, you beat me.
Yeah, we're on the same page about that. I wouldn't be shocked if Tacitus did that either. He's just kind of hard to trust in that sense, and maybe he'll do it one of these days, but he'll probably do it without my money being on him. It's a really tough sequence. I'm not going to go back and recap all of it because there was so much to talk about, but I think we've kind of highlighted that there are many ways to go in these races, not really horses that you feel you can single. So it's one where you're going to have to spread a little bit. And even though it's just a pick four sequence with 4 races, I think this is one that could pay a little bit because I wouldn't be shocked if we see some upsets in this sequence.
No, I wouldn't either. I'm not a big fan of caveman tickets, but this might be a case where I probably wouldn't play a caveman ticket because one thing I will do is go back and look at my tickets, and I don't want any tickets that have 3 or 4 favorites on them. So I'm going to kind of make sure I only have at most 2 on any of them to kind of narrow down the cost a little bit. But otherwise, I do think you have to spread around and hope you get lucky in a couple of them because I do think there's a good chance you will. I don't think this is going to be one of those chalky stakes days that we often see on big cards. I think these races are just too wide open for that.
Well, that's it for this week. Hopefully we give out some good ideas in this sequence at Belmont, and hopefully we can stay on a more regular schedule with these podcasts moving forward. I think we're going to be able to do it, at least one podcast every week as we move into Saratoga. That's the goal. So look for us again next week. But remember, as of now, you can always listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with another TimeformUS Forecast next week.